The morning sun had barely touched the marble floors of the Williams mansion when chaos broke out. For years, the house had followed the same quiet routine: breakfast at 7, meetings at 9, and silence in between. But today, something was terribly wrong. Jonathan Williams, a billionaire known for his calm precision and unshakable control, rushed down the hallway, his footsteps echoing through the massive estate. His usually composed face was pale with fear. In his hands was a coffee cup that trembled slightly, something no one had ever seen before. He burst through his son's bedroom door, calling his name. "Ethan! Come on, buddy, time for breakfast." Silence. The boy, only 8 years old, lay perfectly still on the bed, eyes closed, breathing shallow, his small hand hanging off the side. The color had drained from his face. Jonathan froze, the cup slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. For a moment, time stood still. "Ethan!" His voice broke. "Ethan, wake up!" He rushed to his side, shaking him gently at first, then harder. No response. Panic flooded his chest as his mind went blank. The last time he had seen Ethan alive and smiling was the night before, watching cartoons together. Now, his son looked lifeless. Jonathan shouted for help, his voice echoing through the long corridor. The house staff came running, the cook, the driver, the gardener, all wide-eyed and terrified. And then, among them, came Maria, the new maid. She had started working there just 3 weeks earlier, quiet and humble, barely noticed by most of the staff. While everyone stood frozen, unsure what to do, Maria didn't hesitate. She ran to the bedside, placed 2 fingers on Ethan's neck, and whispered something under her breath. Then she calmly instructed, "Someone call an ambulance. Now." Her tone wasn't panicked, it was focused, sharp, like someone who knew exactly what to do. Jonathan, still shaking, could barely form words. "What's happening to him?" he demanded. Maria didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted Ethan's head slightly and began pressing on his chest with steady hands, counting softly under her breath. Everyone in the room watched, stunned. The billionaire who had always been in control of everything now stood helpless as the maid took charge of saving his son's life. Within moments, Ethan gasped, a weak, trembling breath that broke the silence. Jonathan fell to his knees beside him, his eyes filling with tears. Relief washed over the room, but Maria's expression stayed serious. "He needs a doctor immediately," she said firmly. As sirens approached in the distance, Jonathan looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. Who was this woman who had just saved his son when everyone else froze? That was the moment something shifted in him. The man who had always trusted only money, systems, and control suddenly realized that sometimes, the people who seem the smallest can make the biggest difference. But what Jonathan didn't know yet was that Maria wasn't just any maid, and the truth behind how she knew what to do would soon change everything he thought he knew about his family. The ambulance raced through the quiet streets, red lights flashing against the early morning fog. Jonathan sat inside, gripping his son's cold hand while Maria kept her other hand on Ethan's chest, monitoring his breathing. The paramedics moved quickly, connecting oxygen tubes and checking his pulse. Jonathan's heart pounded as he kept whispering, "Hold on, please." He'd faced billion-dollar deals, crises that would make most men crumble, but nothing compared to this helplessness. His empire meant nothing in that moment. All he wanted was to see his boy open his eyes again. At the hospital, they rushed Ethan into the emergency room. Jonathan tried to follow, but a nurse stopped him. "Sir, please wait outside." Those words cut deeper than any loss he'd ever faced. He stood there frozen in the hallway, staring at the doors that had closed between him and the only family he had left. Then, from the corner of his eye, he noticed Maria. She stood quietly, hands clasped together, eyes closed as if praying. Her uniform was wrinkled, her hair slightly messy from the rush, but her calm presence stood out among the panic. Jonathan walked over slowly, his voice breaking. "How did you know what to do back there?" Maria hesitated. For a moment, she looked away, as if searching for the right words. "I didn't think," she finally said softly. "I just did what I was taught." "Taught?" Jonathan repeated. "Taught by who?" Before she could answer, the doctor came out, pulling off his gloves. "Mr. Williams," he said, his tone careful. "Your son suffered from a severe cardiac arrest, possibly triggered by stress or an underlying condition. He's stable for now, but will need to run more tests." Jonathan exhaled, a shaky sound that felt like it carried years of fear. "Can I see him?" The doctor nodded, and Jonathan turned, but before stepping in, he paused. "She saved him," he said quietly, glancing at Maria. "If she hadn't acted when she did, my son wouldn't be here." The doctor turned to Maria with surprise. "You performed CPR?" Maria nodded gently. I used to be a nurse," she said in a small voice. Jonathan froze. "Used to?" She looked down. Before everything changed. There was something in her tone, pain, regret, that made Jonathan stop asking. He didn't know her story, but something told him it wasn't simple. When he entered Ethan's room, the boy looked small beneath the hospital blankets, his skin pale but his breathing steady. Machines beeped softly around him. Jonathan sat by the bed and took his son's hand again, tears falling silently. "You scared me, buddy," he whispered. "Don't ever do that again." Maria entered quietly a few minutes later, carrying a cup of water. She placed it on the side table and stood near the door. She didn't want to intrude, but her presence somehow made the room feel calmer. Jonathan turned to her. "Why didn't you tell me you were a nurse?" Her eyes lifted to his, unsure how to answer. "Because people like you don't usually hire people like me," she said simply. "I left that life behind. I wasn't planning to ever go back." Jonathan frowned. "What do you mean, left that life behind?" But before she could reply, Ethan stirred. His eyelids fluttered, and Jonathan immediately leaned forward. Hey, you're awake?" Ethan blinked, his voice barely a whisper. "Dad?" Jonathan let out a shaky laugh of relief. "Yeah, it's me. You're okay?" Then Ethan turned his head slightly, his small voice even softer. "Where's Maria?" Jonathan looked at her, standing just behind him. "She's right here, son." Ethan smiled weakly. "Thank you," he said, and then drifted back to sleep. Maria smiled faintly, brushing a tear from her eye. "He's strong," she murmured. Jonathan nodded but said nothing. For the first time, he saw her differently, not as just an employee, but as someone with a story, someone who'd carried pain just like him. He didn't know what her past was, but one thing was clear: she had saved his world. That night, as the hospital lights dimmed and the world outside went quiet, Jonathan stayed by his son's bedside. But his thoughts weren't just about Ethan anymore. They were also about the mysterious maid who had saved his child, and the feeling that maybe, just maybe, she was more connected to their lives than he could ever imagine. The next morning, sunlight crept softly through the blinds of the hospital room. Machines hummed gently beside Ethan's bed, steady and calm, the sound of life continuing. Jonathan sat slouched in the chair beside his son, exhausted but awake. His eyes were on Maria, who stood quietly by the window, her face half lit by the morning light. She looked peaceful, but there was something about her expression, a kind of sadness that didn't belong to that moment. Jonathan had spent most of the night thinking about her words. "I used to be a nurse." That one sentence echoed in his mind. Why would someone leave a career like that to work as a maid? And why had she never mentioned it, even after saving his son's life? He finally spoke, his voice low. "You've been hiding something, Maria." She turned, startled but calm. "Everyone hides something, Mr. Williams," she replied softly. Jonathan leaned forward, his tone more serious. "You saved my son's life. I owe you everything. But I can't pretend I'm not curious. Why would someone like you be cleaning houses instead of working in a hospital?" Maria hesitated. Her fingers gripped the edge of the windowsill. "Because some mistakes," she said slowly, "don't wash away with time. They follow you." Jonathan frowned. "What kind of mistakes?" She took a deep breath. "The kind that cost me my license and someone else their life." The silence that followed was heavy. Jonathan didn't speak, and she didn't look at him. Instead, she walked to the edge of Ethan's bed, adjusted the blanket around the boy, and said softly, "He reminds me of someone I once couldn't save." That was all she said before walking out of the room. Jonathan stayed there, stunned. Her words sank deep into him. He didn't know what story lived behind them, but it was one that clearly haunted her. For a man who had spent years building walls to keep people out, Jonathan now found himself drawn to the one person whose walls were even higher than his. Later that afternoon, Jonathan received a call from his company. There was a major deal that needed his signature. For the first time in years, he told his team, "It can wait." Then he hung up and turned to Maria, who had returned to check on Ethan's four. "I want to know the truth," he said firmly. "All of it." Maria stopped what she was doing. Her shoulders tensed. "It's not something I like talking about." "Then don't think of it as talking," Jonathan replied. "Think of it as clearing the air. You saved my son and I'm grateful, but if you're staying in my home, I deserve to know who you really are." She looked up at him. Her eyes, calm, brown, and tired, met his without fear. "All right," she said quietly. "You want the truth? Then you'll hear it." She sat down and began. Years ago, she had been one of the most promising young nurses in a private hospital in Chicago. Her supervisors loved her. Patients trusted her. Life was simple, until one evening, an accident happened in the emergency ward. A patient, a boy not much older than Ethan, came in after a car crash. He needed urgent care. Maria followed the doctor's orders exactly, but one of the machines had malfunctioned without her knowing. By the time they noticed, it was too late. The boy didn't make it. An investigation followed. The hospital needed someone to blame, and Maria, the youngest on duty that night, became the target. Her warnings about the faulty machine were ignored, her name dragged through reports, and in the end, she was suspended. Without connections or money to fight back, she lost her license and her job. Overnight, her dream was gone. She moved from city to city, taking small cleaning jobs just to survive. But she never stopped helping where she could, volunteering in community clinics, taking care of sick elders, even though she could never officially practice again. "That's how I ended up here," she said softly. "Your agency needed someone to help your son. I didn't come for the money. I came because I saw his file. I saw his condition. And I couldn't ignore it." Jonathan listened quietly. For once, he didn't interrupt. He was used to people justifying themselves, employees, partners, lawyers, but there was something different about the way Maria spoke. She wasn't begging for sympathy. She was telling the truth, raw and plain. After a long pause, Jonathan asked, "So when you saw Ethan yesterday, it reminded you of that boy?" Maria nodded slowly. "Yes. I couldn't save him. But I could save your son." Jonathan leaned back in his chair. For years, he had believed no one cared deeply or honestly anymore. But now, looking at the woman in front of him, he wasn't sure. That night, after Maria left the hospital, Jonathan stayed awake thinking. For the first time in years, his thoughts weren't filled with anger or suspicion, they were filled with questions about forgiveness, about second chances. He looked at his son sleeping peacefully, alive because of the woman he had once doubted, and whispered, maybe I was wrong about people." Meanwhile, as Maria walked home in the cool night air, she looked up at the stars and whispered to herself, "Thank you." It wasn't to anyone specific, maybe to fate, maybe to life, or maybe to that lost boy she still carried in her heart. Little did she know, her act of compassion that night had not only saved Ethan, it had started to heal the broken walls inside Jonathan's heart, too. Days passed, and the mansion slowly began to feel different. The silence that once echoed through its marble halls started to fade, replaced by the quiet sounds of life returning, the faint hum of conversation, the distant laughter of Ethan, and the gentle clatter of Maria moving through the house. Ethan's recovery was slow but steady. Each morning, Maria helped him with his stretches and light therapy. She was patient, always encouraging him with small smiles and words of hope. "Just one more step," she would say softly, guiding his hand to the wheelchair rail. And each time he tried, Ethan felt a little stronger, not just in his body but in his spirit too. Jonathan watched all this from a distance at first, pretending to stay busy with work. But more often than not, he found himself pausing outside the living room door, listening to their voices. There was something healing in the way Maria spoke, calm, confident, and kind, the way his late wife once was. One afternoon, Jonathan walked into the living room, finding Maria and Ethan laughing over a board game. Ethan's eyes lit up when he saw his father, something that hadn't happened in a long time. "Dad, look," Ethan said, grinning. "Maria beat me again." Jonathan managed a small smile, one that felt unfamiliar on his face. "She seems good at everything," he said, half joking. Maria chuckled. "He's improving fast. At this rate, he'll be beating me in a week." Jonathan nodded, his gaze shifting between the two of them. "You're doing a lot for him," he said quietly. "I'm just doing what anyone would," Maria replied. But Jonathan shook his head. "No. Not everyone would care like this." The room fell quiet for a moment. Ethan returned to the game, humming softly while Maria and Jonathan exchanged a silent glance, a mix of gratitude, curiosity, and something neither of them could quite name. That night, Jonathan found himself sitting in his study, unable to concentrate. On his desk lay the same family photo Maria had once picked up, the one of him, his wife, and Ethan as a baby. He stared at it for a long time before turning to the hidden screen on his desk. The security footage from the day of the incident was still saved. He opened it, not to watch in suspicion this time, but to see what he had missed. The screen flickered, showing Maria rushing into Ethan's room, her hands steady, her face composed but urgent. There was no panic, no hesitation, just instinct and care. He remembered that night vividly, the fear, the helplessness, and now seeing it from this angle broke something inside him. He had trusted no one for so long that he couldn't see what was right in front of him. A woman who had risked everything for his son, not out of duty, but out of love. The next morning, Jonathan joined them for breakfast, something he hadn't done in months. Ethan was surprised but happy. Maria served coffee, her hands trembling slightly from the unexpected company. Jonathan cleared his throat. "Maria," he began, "I want to apologize." She looked at him, confused. "For what, sir?" "For not seeing you for who you really are. For assuming the worst. I put cameras in my own home to catch people doing wrong, and yet the only thing I caught was someone doing right." Maria's eyes softened, but she didn't speak. Jonathan continued, his voice quieter now. "You've brought something back into this house I thought was gone forever." Ethan smiled shyly, looking between them. "Dad, can Maria stay forever?" he asked innocently. Maria's lips curved into a small smile, but Jonathan didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her, really looked at her. For the first time, he saw not a maid or a stranger, but a woman carrying her own scars, just like him. "If she wants to," he said finally. That afternoon, the three of them went outside together. It was the first time Ethan had been out in the garden since the accident. The sun was warm, and the scent of freshly cut grass filled the air. Maria pushed his wheelchair slowly down the path lined with roses, while Jonathan walked beside them. "You know," Maria said, "your wife loved this garden. The gardener told me she planted those roses herself." Jonathan's steps slowed. "You talked to the gardener?" "He mentioned it once," she said. "Said she called them her second chances because she planted them after a storm destroyed the first ones." Jonathan looked at the roses, now in full bloom, bright, alive, and stubbornly beautiful. "That sounds like her," he murmured. Ethan leaned back in his chair, looking up at the sky. "Mom would like that we're out here together," he said. Jonathan blinked hard, feeling his throat tighten. "Yeah," he whispered. "She would." As they stood there, Maria felt the tension that had once filled the house slowly dissolve. The cold, lonely mansion was beginning to feel like a home again. The laughter of a child, the warmth of forgiveness, and the courage to trust again were slowly rebuilding what grief had broken. Later that evening, as the sun set, Jonathan found Maria standing on the back porch, gazing at the horizon. He joined her quietly. "You've changed everything around here," he said. Maria smiled faintly. "Not everything, Mr. Williams. Just the parts that wanted to heal." He looked at her for a long moment. "You don't have to call me Mr. Williams anymore," he said softly. "Jonathan is fine." For the first time, Maria looked him in the eyes and nodded. Then thank you, Jonathan, for trusting me. He smiled, a real smile this time. No, Maria. Thank you for giving me a reason to try again. And as the last light faded behind the trees, the two stood in silence, no longer strangers bound by tragedy, but two people learning, slowly but surely, that even the most broken hearts can find their way back to life. Weeks had passed since that quiet evening on the porch, and the mansion that once felt like a prison had turned into a home again. Laughter now echoed in the hallways where silence used to live. Ethan's health was improving faster than anyone expected. He could now move his legs slightly on his own and often bragged about it with pride. Maria had become more than just the maid. She was family. She joined them at breakfast, helped Ethan with his lessons, and even convinced Jonathan to take short walks outside again. The cold, gray air that once filled the house was replaced with warmth, the kind that only love and trust could bring back. One morning, as the golden light poured into the living room, Jonathan called Maria into his study. She walked in, a little nervous, unsure of what he wanted to discuss. "Maria," he began softly, "I went through some of my late wife's things last night. There was a letter she wrote years ago, before the accident." He picked up an old envelope and handed it to her. It was addressed to someone named Maria Lopez. Maria froze. "That's my mother's name." Jonathan blinked. "Your mother?" "Yes," she said, voice trembling. "She worked as a nurse for your wife years ago, before she passed away. My mother used to talk about a kind woman who treated her like family." Jonathan sat back, his expression softening as the truth unfolded. "Your mother took care of my wife during her pregnancy. I remember her, always gentle, always smiling. My wife said she was the only one who could calm her down when the pain was too much." He looked up, his voice low. "I didn't know you were her daughter." Maria's eyes glistened. "She passed away when I was 17. I didn't know your wife had written her a letter." Jonathan handed it over. "Maybe it was meant for you all along." Maria unfolded the fragile paper, the ink slightly faded. "Dear Maria, if you ever find yourself lost in this world, I want you to remember what you taught me. Kindness always finds its way back home. You helped me through my hardest days. If life ever brings you to my family again, I hope they'll know they've met someone special." Maria's hands trembled as she finished reading. Tears slid down her cheeks, and Jonathan's eyes glistened too. The room was silent except for Ethan's laughter echoing faintly from the garden, the sound of healing, of life continuing. Jonathan spoke quietly. "I think she did bring you back to us, in her own way." Maria smiled through her tears. Maybe this is what she meant by kindness finding its way home. He nodded slowly. It seemed she was right. From that day forward, Jonathan stopped calling her the maid. She was part of the family, not because of her mother's past, but because of the light she had brought into their lives. Months later, on a bright morning, Ethan took his first full steps in the garden, unsteady but strong. Maria and Jonathan stood side by side, watching him walk toward them, his face glowing with pride. "I told you I'd walk again," Ethan shouted, his laughter filling the air. Jonathan knelt, tears in his eyes, and hugged his son tightly. "You did, son, you did." Maria stood nearby, smiling, her heart full. Jonathan looked up at her, this time with gratitude, not suspicion. "You saved him," he said simply. Maria shook her head. "No, he saved us." The sun glowed warmly over them, bathing the garden in light. The roses, the same ones Jonathan's late wife had planted, were in full bloom again. And as the wind moved softly through the petals, it felt as if life itself was whispering a quiet truth, that even after loss, even after fear and mistrust, love can return in the most unexpected form. For Jonathan, Ethan, and Maria, the mansion was no longer a place of grief. It had become a home once more, a home built not by walls or wealth, but by forgiveness, faith, and the courage to begin again.